I drove back into Willow Creek with the kind of tightness in my chest I used to get before walking into an interrogation room. 9 years away should have softened the edges, but as the town limits came into view, every old bruise under my ribs seemed to wake up. Abby sat in the back seat, humming a song she made up, swinging her little legs in those canvas shoes she insisted on wearing even in cold weather. She was 7, bright, tender, and full of a hope I was terrified this place might crush. I kept telling myself that coming home was necessary, that Mom's health and the questions I had carried too long meant I could not avoid it anymore. But the truth was, even at 32, driving toward Dad's house made me feel like that 23-year-old again, the one he'd pushed out because I dared to dream beyond the borders he drew. I pulled into the driveway just past 5 in the evening. The air smelled like damp leaves and the faint sweetness of the neighbors' firewood. Abby reached for my hand the moment we stepped out, her fingers tiny, warm, as if she sensed the weight pressing against my spine. The house looked the same. No matter how many years passed, Dad kept it frozen in time, the porch light flickering at the exact broken angle I remembered. It felt like walking back into a memory that never healed right. I could hear voices inside, the loud, cheerful ones that fill a house before a family dinner, but there was no warmth in them for me. When we stepped through the front door, the room quieted just enough to make the shift obvious. Nathan stood near the kitchen island with a drink, his shoulders broader than before, his expression carefully amused. Marilyn hovered beside him, polished and cold. Dad sat at the head of the long dining table, the same seat he used to claim when I was a kid. He looked right at me like I had brought rain into his house. Abby squeezed my hand tighter and whispered that she wanted to sit close to me. Her fear settled under my skin like static. We moved toward the table, and that hush returned. The kind that makes you aware of every step you take. Everyone else was already misconversations about work promotions and new purchases. Nathan bragging about a property investment he had just made. He launched into a story about a bonus he received that sounded bigger than what his job title should allow. But I kept my eyes on Abby. She was trying so hard to be polite, the way I taught her. Dad didn't greet us, just nodded stiffly, as if he were acknowledging the arrival of someone he had not invited, but was tolerating for the sake of appearances. Before I go any further, I should tell you something. I know many of you listen to these stories while cooking dinner or folding laundry or driving home from a long shift. What are you doing while listening now? For me, on that night, as all of this happened, I was sitting at a table where every chair felt colder than the one before. The dinner began with forced politeness. Play blades passed, hands brushed, smiles tightened. Abby tried to chat with Oliver, Nathan's 6-year-old son, who was standing beside his chair swinging a toy truck. She asked if she could sit next to him. He planted his hands on his hips, the way kids do when they imitate adults. Then he pointed straight at Abby, and then at me. His little voice came out sharper than it should have been possible for a 6-year-old. You and your mom have no place here. Grandfather said you are our family embarrassment. There are moments in life when time stretches, when the sounds in the room warp, when your breath gets stuck halfway up your throat, when what you are hearing feels unreal, but familiar in the worst way. That was one of those moments. The table erupted, not in shock or correction, but laughter. Loud, rolling laughter. Marilyn covered her mouth like Oliver had told a cute joke. Nathan actually slapped the table. And Dad, he didn't laugh loudly, but the satisfaction in his eyes was enough to burn me alive. Abby's face crumpled, her little shoulders hunching, as if someone had dimmed all the warmth inside her. It was the exact expression I used to feel on my own face when Dad called me dramatic or foolish for wanting more than this town. Seeing that same pain on my daughter was like watching my own childhood replay, but with sharper colors and crueler contrast. I reached for her hand, letting her tuck herself into my side. The room spun with laughter, sounds clinking off the glasses, while I tried to swallow the ache rising in my throat. No one corrected Oliver. No one looked uncomfortable except Mom, who sat still with a tremble in her fingers. She opened her mouth once, maybe to protest, but Dad gave her a look that shut her down instantly. Abby whispered that she wanted to go home. Her voice was so small, it barely reached my ears. I rubbed her back and told her she was safe with me. Safe. That word felt like a fragile promise in a house like this. Dinner dragged on. The roast chicken grew cold while conversations layered over each other, excluding me and Abby completely. Jonathan bragged about his investments. Marilyn complimented Dad's leadership at whatever community board he was now chaired, and Mom kept glancing at me with that defeated look I hated to see. Abby stayed pressed against my side, her appetite gone. I tried to ground myself in the details around me, the clink of utensils, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint perfume of Marilyn's hairspray, anything to keep from reacting the way my younger self would have reacted. When we were nearly done eating, Dad leaned back in his chair and cleared his throat. He spoke to me without using my name. He asked how long I planned to stay in Willow Creek. The way he said stay made it sound like contamination. I told him we wouldn't be here long, that Abby still had school back in Raleigh. He made a sound under his breath and said that children do better with stability, especially when their mother makes impulsive choices. The word impulsive hit like a flicked match. That word was his favorite excuse when he cut me down for choosing the FBI over the family business. He said he never understood why I wasted years chasing criminals when my place was here, supporting what he built. It was the same script, just recycled in a fresh insult. After dinner, Dad stood and told me to step outside with him. The sky had turned a deep blue, the kind that comes right before a storm. The porch light flickered like it always had. We walked into the yard behind the house, where the grass was brittle under our shoes. He told me Abby was too sensitive, that I had filled her head with dramatic ideas. He said only a fool would stay in a career that never amounted to anything. When he said that word, fool, something inside me snapped. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, like a small hinge inside my ribs had broken loose and let the truth flow out. I looked at him. At the man who raised me through fear more than guidance, at the man who taught me that obedience mattered more than ambition, and I felt a calm rise in my chest. It was the kind of calm that comes right before someone tells the truth they have held for too many years. I told him I was done, and then I said the 6 words that had been building inside me since I was 23. I said, I am done hiding your dirty secrets. He stared at me, stunned, for the first time in years, maybe decades, and for one breath, one suspended beat of the evening air, I realized that even bullies can be afraid when someone finally stands up and speaks the truth. I did not elaborate. I did not raise my voice. Those 6 words were enough. They hung between us, heavy and undeniable. Inside the house, I heard Abby laughing with Mom at something small and gentle, a sound that gave me just enough strength to turn away from Dad. Maybe he realized it too, that something old had finally cracked open, because he did not follow me back inside. I felt the night pressing in around us, quiet and watchful, as if the town itself was waiting to see what would happen next. Sometimes, a single moment divides your life into before and after. That night, as I closed the back door behind me and saw Abby run toward me with relief in her eyes, I knew exactly which side of the line I stood on. I held Abby close for a long moment after she ran into my arms, her breath warm against my shoulder as if she had been holding it the entire time. Night. The house behind us hummed with muted voices and clinking dishes, but none of it mattered now. I kissed the top of her head, whispered that we were going to be all right, and guided her toward the small guest room Mom had made up for us. Abby crawled into bed without protest, curling under the blanket the way she always did when she needed to protect her heart. I sat on the edge of the mattress, brushing her hair back until her eyes fluttered shut. Only when her breathing slowed did I let myself feel the weight of what I had said outside. I am done hiding your dirty secrets. 6 words that had lived inside me for almost a decade. Saying them felt like snapping a chain, one I had carried so long, I forgot its weight. Yet the moment they left my mouth, the air around me had shifted in a way I could not take back. Dad had always counted on silence, mine especially. Breaking that silence lit something inside me that would not go out again. I stepped out of the room and closed the door gently. The hallway lights were dimmed and the house smelled faintly of lemon cleaner. Mom was at the far end of the hall, picking up napkins and stray utensils left after dinner. She looked smaller than I remembered, her shoulders slightly hunched, her movement slow, as if she wanted to disappear into the routine of cleaning. I offered to help, but she shook her head and said she was almost done. There was a tremble in her voice that made my heart tighten. I wanted to ask her what she had heard outside, if she had seen the look Dad gave me, but I could not bring myself to make the night heavier for her. Later, when I finally lay down on the firm guest bed, my mind circled back to the past, to the day everything in our family cracked. I was 23, freshly graduated, stubborn in a way only young women chasing their purpose can be. I had dreamed of the FBI Academy since high school. The idea of investigating financial crimes, using numbers like puzzle pieces that revealed the truth, lit something in me that nothing else did. I spent months preparing. I worked part-time, trained early in the morning, studied until I fell asleep with my head on my textbooks. I wanted a life built on what I was good at, not on what Dad wanted from me. When I finally received the acceptance letter, I remember holding it with both hands because they were shaking so badly. I walked into the living room where Dad was reading the newspaper. I told him I had been accepted. For a moment, just a breath, I thought he would be proud. Instead, he set the paper down so slowly, it felt like he was building suspense for a punishment. He asked why I would even consider this when he had already laid out a stable future for me at the family company. He said I should handle the accounting department. He said he needed someone he could trust. At the time, I thought he meant trust in a fatherly way. Years later, I would understand trust meant control. It meant keeping me where he could decide the truth for me. I told him that it was my life and that this was what I wanted. He stood up so fast, his chair screeched across the floor. He said that if I left for Quantico, then I was no longer part of this family. Nathan sided with him immediately. I still remember Nathan's exact words, the way he smirked like my dream was a childish stunt. He said Lauren is just chasing a fantasy. Dad's right. She will be back in 6 months begging for her job. Hearing them team up like that hurt more than I expected. It was the first time I realized that in this house, loyalty flowed upward only to Dad, never sideways to each other. The day I left, Mom clung to me at the door. She cried so hard her breaths came out in gasps. Dad stood in the kitchen and did not come to say goodbye. Nathan watched from the top of the stairs with crossed arms. I remember gripping the steering wheel of my old sedan, heart pounding, knowing I was choosing a future without the people who were supposed to stand behind me. I was choosing myself. It should have felt empowering. Instead, it felt like stepping off a cliff. Back in the present, as I lay on the guest bed, the house felt too quiet. I knew Dad was still awake. I could sense him through the walls, the way you feel a storm coming long before the first crack of thunder. After a while, I forced myself up and walked down the hall to get a glass of water. On the dining table, Mom's purse sat open with some receipts and loose bills sticking out. When I shifted it slightly to make room for my glass, a sealed envelope slid out and fell onto the floor. I bent down, picked it up, and recognized the return address of the local bank. I only meant to set it back inside the purse, but the paper felt unusually thick. Curiosity tugged at me. Mom rarely left financial documents lying around. Before I had time to talk myself out of it, I opened the flap. Inside was a copy of a loan agreement taken out in Mom's name. A loan far larger than anything she would need for herself. The signature at the bottom was supposed to be hers, but it was not. The strokes were sloppy, the spacing wrong. The tail of the W looped upward in a way Mom never wrote. I had seen enough forged documents in my career to recognize a fake. My chest tightened. I looked toward the hallway, but Mom was not there. She must have missed the envelope without realizing it. My hands shook with anger and something close to grief. Why would she hide this? Or, more accurately, why would she need to? I walked to the living room where she was folding blankets and asked her, calmly, if she knew about a loan under her name. Her entire body froze. She did not even attempt to pretend she did not understand what I meant. Her eyes filled with panic before she looked away and said she must have misplaced something. It was the same tone she used to use when Dad scolded her in front of guests. Soft, practiced, frightened. She could not meet my eyes. That told me everything. While Mom scrambled for a way out of the moment, a small sound drifted from the stairwell. Oliver's voice. He was talking to Nathan upstairs, parroting something he must have heard earlier. He said Aunt Lauren never listens. Grandpa says she ruins everything." The words floated down the staircase like a ghost of my childhood. I stood there, holding the forged document in my hand, and felt a wave of cold move through me. It was more than a habit. It was a pattern repeating itself through generations. I told Mom we would talk tomorrow when she felt rested. She nodded quickly, grateful for the escape. I walked back to the guest room and stood outside Abby's door. Her soft breathing calmed something inside me. I slipped into bed beside her and stared at the ceiling. The cracks in the plaster looked like a map of every decision I made to get us here. I could feel the weight of the loan envelope under my pillow. I did not know yet where the trail would lead, but I knew this much. Whatever had happened to Mom did not start today. It started years ago, long before Abby was born, and the truth had been waiting for me to come back. When morning came, nothing in the house would look the same again. Chapter 3. Morning light slipped into the room in thin lines across the ceiling, and for a moment, I tried to believe everything from the night before had been a dream. But the weight of that envelope under my pillow reminded me it was all painfully real. I eased myself out of bed so I would not wake Abby. She was curled on her side with her hands tucked under her cheek, the way she slept when something had shaken her. I brushed a strand of hair from her forehead and stepped quietly into the hallway. The house was still. Mom was already in the kitchen, stirring something on the stove, her shoulders tense in the way that told me she had barely slept. She offered a tired smile when I walked in, but her eyes flicked toward her purse where it sat on the counter. I felt a sting of guilt, not because I had seen something I should not have, but because she clearly lived in fear of the very man she shared a roof with. The fear was so familiar, it made my stomach twist. I carried my coffee to the dining table and laid the loan document flat. The numbers and dates looked even more suspicious in the daylight. The loan had been initiated the same year Dad dealt with the fallout from an investment disaster that nearly cost him the company. That was before he sold it in 2020. I remembered hearing whispers about it while I was in the academy. Dad blamed poor market conditions, but something about his story never quite added up. Seeing this forged loan made the picture clearer. When his finances began falling apart, he did what he always did. He hid the truth and forced someone else to bear the cost. I asked Mom gently if she remembered signing anything from the bank around that time. Her spoon froze midair. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then shut it again. She said she must have forgotten. Her voice was brittle, like she had rehearsed the line 100 times. I did not push her. Not yet. Some answers reveal themselves when people feel safe, and Mom did not feel safe in this house. While I sipped my coffee, Abby wandered in wearing her pajamas covered with little stars. She climbed onto my lap and rested her head against my shoulder. She asked if we had to stay here for long. I told her only as long as we needed to help Grandma. That seemed to comfort her. But then she said something that made me nearly drop my cup. She said Grandma once told her that Grandpa liked to take her papers at night, and that she had to hide them sometimes. Abby said it with the innocence of a child repeating a strange story, not realizing how damning it truly was. My heart was hammered. Stealing personal documents at night sounded like something Dad would do if he needed a signature that was not willingly given. The thought of him creeping into Mom's room while she slept filled me with a cold fury I had not known before. By late morning, I knew I needed perspective from someone who had known this family long enough to see the cracks forming before they widened. So Abby and I walked down the street to visit Margot Kensington. Margot had lived next door to my parents since before I was born. She was retired now, spending her days gardening and keeping an eye on the neighborhood with the kind of sharpness age had not dulled. When she opened the door and saw me, her eyes softened in a way that felt like a balm on my skin. She invited us in and poured lemonade for Abby while we talked. I asked how things had been around here the last few years. Margot sighed, settling into her chair. She said Dad had changed a lot after I left. He was harsher, more controlling, and often said Mom embarrassed him when she forgot things or questioned him in public. Margot said he talked about me, too. He said I had brought shame to the family by rejecting everything he had built. Seeing that made an old wound reopen. Margot patted my hand in a way only older women can when they see pain resurface. I asked her carefully if she had ever noticed anything strange at the house around 2018. her brows knit together. She said she remembered a night of heavy rain when she saw Dad in the driveway with a younger man she did not know. They were hauling boxes from the garage and loading them into the back of a truck. She thought it was odd because Dad rarely touched anything in the garage and never worked with strangers late at night. She remembered the exact sound of the boxes hitting the truck bed because the noise echoed across the wet driveway. I felt my throat tighten. Boxes moved in the dark always meant one thing in cases I had worked: evidence being removed before anyone could find it. Abby finished her drink and went to play with Margot's old cat in the living room. I sat there for a while, absorbing every detail Margot gave me. The pattern was becoming unmistakable. Dad hid things. Dad forged things. Dad manipulated the people closest to him until they performed the version of the truth he wanted. And Mom had been trapped under that for longer than I could fathom. We thanked Margot and walked back toward the house. The sun had climbed higher by then, warming the street in patches. I held Abby's hand, but her fingers felt tense. When we reached the yard, Oliver was out front playing with a toy car in the gravel. Abby gave him a small wave, hoping for something kinder than the night before. Instead, he looked up, planted his hands on his hips again, and repeated a line that hit me like a blow to the sternum. He said, "Grandpa said you two should be grateful he even lets you visit." Abby froze. Her whole body seemed to fold inward. The sparkle in her eyes dimmed. She asked me in a trembling voice why Grandpa did not like us. I crouched down and held her close, telling her she was loved, telling her none of this was her fault. But inside me, something fierce and cold locked into place. A quiet determination, shaped by years of swallowing truth and shrinking myself to survive. It was one thing for Dad to come after me. It was another thing entirely for him to reach into the next generation with the same poison. Standing there in the yard with Oliver's words hanging in the air and Abby trembling against me, I felt the old fear burn away. In its place was clarity. Whatever Dad had done, whatever he had stolen or forged or buried, the time for silence had ended long before I ever said those 6 words to him. Now, more than ever, I needed to find the truth. I took Abby inside and helped her wash her face. She tried to smile as if nothing had happened, but the hurt clung to her. I tucked her hair behind her ears and told her that sometimes grown-ups say things they should never say, and that unkind words often reveal more about them, speaker, than about the person they target. She nodded, pretending she understood, wanting to be strong. She was braver than I had ever been at her age. As afternoon light settled across the living room, I sat at the kitchen table again, with the loan documents spread out in front of me. The dates, the forged signature, the amount so out of character for Mom. The unexplained boxes in 2018, the remarks Dad made about me and Mom, the way Oliver repeated things that were never meant to be heard by children. Every piece threaded together in a way that made my pulse thrum with both fear and purpose. I felt a shift inside me, a quiet one, but powerful enough to tell me the direction I needed to go next. And once I took the first step, there would be no turning back. Chapter 4. I held that quiet determination inside me for the rest of the afternoon, letting it settle like a stone in my chest. By the time early evening rolled around, Abby was drawing pictures in Mom's room, and Mom was resting after a long morning of pretending everything was normal. I needed answers, and there was only one place to go if I wanted to understand how deeply this family rot had spread. Nathan's house sat just 10 minutes away, tucked inside a newer development with manicured lawns and driveways polished to a shine. It was the kind of neighborhood where everything looked perfect from the end, outside, which somehow made me dread what I might find inside even more. Nathan opened the door wearing a fitted sweater, the kind that tried a little too hard to look casual. He gave me a smile that never reached his eyes. His home looked more like a staged catalog than a place a real family lived. Modern furniture, expensive wall art, marble counters gleaming under soft recessed lighting. I remembered his salary from the last time I checked his public records and silently calculated. None of this matched a middle management paycheck. Not remotely. Marilyn walked out from the kitchen holding a glass of wine, her eyes widening just a bit at seeing me. She recovered quickly and offered a polite greeting, but something about her expression flickered every time her gaze landed on me, as if she were bracing for questions she hoped I would not ask. I kept my tone light and told them I came by for a quick visit. Want the conversation to feel harmless at first. Nathan guided me into the living room, gesturing to the leather sofa that still had price tags tucked under them. Cushions. He always was careless with details. He asked if Mom had been dramatic during my stay, and if that was why I suddenly showed interest in old family matters. The comment was laced with mockery. Nathan never missed a chance to diminish anything outside Dad's orbit. I asked how work was going, pretending not to notice the way Marilyn stiffened when I mentioned finances. She quickly excused herself to check on something in the kitchen. Nathan chuckled and said money stresses her out sometimes, and that I should ignore it. I walked around the room slowly, taking in every detail. The bookshelves were filled with decorative items rather than actual books. A framed photo showed Nathan shaking hands with a man I did not recognize, outside the old Whitmore office building. In the corner of his home office, the door left slightly ajar, I saw the edge of a large metal safe peeking out from behind his desk. A thin line of light glinted from its edge, just enough to show it had not been shut properly. Nathan noticed my line of sight immediately. His posture snapped, his voice sharpening as he stepped between me and the doorway. He said I should respect their privacy and that rummaging through other people's things was a habit I needed to break. I told him I was not rummaging. I was just looking around. He crossed his arms in that familiar way that mirrored Dad so closely it made my stomach turn. He said people who come home suddenly and start poking around usually have something to hide. He asked if I was back because my great FBI career had fizzled out. And I had. Nowhere else to go. The insult hit exactly the way he intended, like a jab meant to knock the wind out of me. But after everything I had learned in the last 24 hours, Nathan's opinion meant nothing compared to the truth waiting under the surface. I asked him if he remembered anything unusual at Dad's office in the last few years. He smirked and said I was digging for conspiracy theories, and that I should let sleeping dogs lie before someone gets bitten. His voice dropped lower when he said the last part. It was not advice. It was a warning. I kept my expression neutral. If there was one thing my work had taught me, it was that guilty people always give themselves away through overreaction, not silence. Nathan was overreacting to everything. While he talked, Marilyn reappeared, tense, carrying a tray of crackers that she almost dropped when she saw the loan document sticking out of my bag. She forced a smile, but her hands trembled slightly. It was clear she knew more than she wanted to admit. Before I could question her, someone knocked on the door. Nathan went to answer it. It was their neighbor, Mr. Collins, a retired man who always wore suspenders and carried a dog leash, even when his old beagle refused to walk. He greeted me warmly, surprised to see me back in town. Nathan excused himself to take a phone call, leaving me with Marilyn and Mr. Collins. He stepped inside for just a moment and struck up conversation the way older men often do, effortlessly and without filter. He told me he had missed seeing me around and asked if I remembered the mess at the old Whitmore office a few years back. My pulse quickened. I asked what mess I had made. He said he remembered seeing Nathan late at night, carrying boxes out of the building right before the new owners took over. It had been raining heavily that night, the same stormy week Margot had mentioned. He thought it was odd at the time, but since Nathan said Dad asked him to handle some leftover files, he assumed it was family business. I felt a chill move along my spine. Two different neighbors, same kind of story. Late nights. Boxes. File moved in secret. Nathan turned the corner just then, his expression shifting when he saw me listening intently. He hurried Mr. Collins out with a polite but firm smile that never reached his eyes. When the door closed, Daniel said people in this town loved gossip and that I should not believe everything I heard. His tone was sharp, too sharp. Marilyn looked at the floor, twisting the wedding band on her finger. She finally whispered that everyone was stressed lately, and that Nathan just wanted to protect the family. Nathan shot her a look so quick and so pointed that she fell silent mid-sentence. Abby tugged at my shirt just then. She had wandered over from the yard where she had been playing with Oliver. Her eyes were too shiny, too full, the way they got when she was trying not to cry. She whispered that Oliver had told her something new. "David says your mom ruins everything." Those words hit harder than I expected. It was not just the cruelty. It was the fact that the script had not changed for decades. Dad had said the same kind of things about Mom. He had said the same kinds of things about me. And now Nathan's 6-year-old child was repeating them to my daughter like they were family truths, carved into stone. I held Abby close and felt a swell of anger rise under my ribs, steady and controlled. This was not just about old files or forged signatures. This was about a legacy of manipulation that stretched farther and deeper than I had realized. It was clear Nathan was protecting Dad. It was clear he was teaching his child the same destructive language Dad had used for years. And it was clear that whatever was in that safe, whatever was in those boxes, removed under cover of night, was part of a larger truth Nathan could not afford for me to find. I told Abby we were leaving and thanked Marilyn for the visit. She nodded, relief washing over her face as if she had been holding her breath since the moment I stepped inside. Nathan did not walk us to the door. He just stood there in the hallway, arms crossed, jaw tight, as if daring me to come any closer to whatever he was hiding. When we stepped back into the cool evening air, I felt something shift inside me again. A deeper certainty settled in my bones. The truth was not only buried, it was protected, and the people protecting it were getting nervous. It was the first real sign I was getting close. Cole's warning echoed in my mind the entire drive back to Willow Creek, the kind of echo that sits low in your chest and refuses to settle. The sun had dipped behind the ridge by the time I reached the edge of town, and the sky had turned the same muted purple I remembered from summer nights. When I was a teenager, long before I understood what my family was capable of hiding, Abby had fallen asleep in the back seat, curled against her stuffed rabbit, her breathing deep and even. I envied her ability to slip into peace so easily. Peace felt like a foreign language to me now. I pulled into the small visitor's lot behind the Willow Creek Public Library, where Cole had arranged to meet me. He walked toward me from the back door, carrying a satchel stuffed with old notebooks and a few laminated press badges. He greeted me with a handshake that was firm but not aggressive. A man who had learned to read truth by watching people's eyes rather than part their words. We sat at a metal picnic table under a dim security light that flickered every few seconds. Cole wasted no time. He opened one of his notebooks and pointed to a page marked with a faded tab. He reminded me of the 2018 Community Fund investigation. I remembered hearing whispers about it, but had been buried in academy training. Then, too focused on surviving Quantico obstacles and written exams to track the data. Scandals. Back home. He explained how the fund was created after the major storm floods that spring. Dozens of small businesses had been destroyed, entire streets submerged, and residents needed immediate help. The town rallied together. Donations poured in. Grants were advertised as a lifeline. But the actual work moved slower than cold honey. Projects stalled, applicants complained, and no one could clearly explain where the money had gone. Until Cole noticed something strange. He found that some of the fund applications came from the same home addresses, but had different names listed. He noticed that approval signatures seemed inconsistent, the ink strokes shifting style from one document to another, and he found that the largest grants, including the grant promised to Mrs. Teresa Vaughn, had no documented follow-up. The money simply disappeared. One of the victims, he said, was Teresa. She had lived in the white cottage on Laurel Lane, the one with the red shutters and wind chimes that jingled even when there was no breeze. I remembered her. She used to slip candy to neighborhood kids on Halloween, long after she once stopped handing out full bags. Her kindness was the kind people felt before they ever spoke to her. Cole said she put $30,000 into what she thought was a matching business restoration program. Dad reassured her personally that she would qualify. He wore trust like a second skin back then. Teresa believed him. She received no grant match, no call, no explanation. And by the time she realized something was wrong, the money she had invested was gone. She had to sell her home and move in with a sister she barely knew. Quell left gone to interview her. He said she cried halfway through the conversation and apologized to him for being so emotional. Women like Teresa never thought they were allowed to be angry, only ashamed. My stomach tightened. Dad had done that. David, the man who lectured me about integrity every Sunday morning, had let someone like Teresa fall into financial ruin while he sat comfortably in the Whitmore house drinking bourbon and praising himself for being a pillar of the community. Cole said he and his editor pushed the investigation as far as they could, but too many files disappeared. Too many interviews went cold. And then the newspaper pulled the plug. Without solid evidence, publishing the accusations could have destroyed the paper legally, but he never stopped digging. He kept everything. Note, scanned records, photos. He carried those ghosts around for years, like weights he could not put down. I asked him why he thought Dad was involved. He paused, looking out into the dark parking lot before answering. He said my dad had been running personal debts since before the 2018 storm, long before the fund was established. He had noticed how quickly Dad's lifestyle bounced back after the storm, even though the business had been crawling on fumes. And he had overheard 2 sources mention that Dad used IOUs long before IOUs were necessary, the kind of financial desperation that often leads to cutting corners when no one is watching. I felt something inside me tilt, as if my internal compass had just swung in a new direction. It was not the shock of hearing something terrible. It was the confirmation of something I had sensed since childhood, something I had ignored for the sake of keeping the peace. Dad had always been careful with his image. He carried secrecy the way some men carried pocket knives. Cole leaned closer. He said Dad was a name that came up repeatedly in interviews, but always in whispers. People said they trusted him, but their eyes looked away when they said it. People said he helped them, but they could never explain exactly how. And whenever Cole got close to a breakthrough, the person he was interviewing suddenly declined to participate further. Then he told me the most important part, because I was a federal agent whose immediate family member had been targeted. With identity forgery, I now had the legal authority to access any financial trail that might connect to that forgery. And if Dad, even indirectly, signed or approved any document that contained my mom's stolen signature, that gave me a direct entry point. A legal one. Cole said he suspected that the clipped threads he could never tie together might now be within my reach. I thanked him, genuinely. It felt like the ground had shifted under my feet, but this time it was shifting in a direction that made sense. I carried Abby to the car, letting her sleep peacefully against my shoulder. For all the chaos swirling around us, she remained the one thing in my life untouched by manipulation. As I drove through town, I noticed how different everything looked now. The same corner stores, the same post office, the same diner where Dad held his Saturday breakfasts. Yet every building felt as though it had secrets pressed into the walls. Secret I had walked past for years without knowing they were there. When I reached Mom's house, I tucked Abby into bed and walked to the kitchen. Mom was reading a recipe card at the table, but she looked up quickly when I entered. Her expression was soft, but wary. She had been walking on eggshells since I found that loan document. I knew she wanted to ask what happened today, but she also knew not to press. I assured her we had a quiet evening and kissed her forehead before heading upstairs. I tried to sleep, but couldn't. So I sat on the back porch with my laptop and logged into the federal case database. I started an unofficial draft of an identity misuse complaint. It would allow me to request the loan documents officially. It felt surreal typing Mom's name into forms that had been created to protect victims. It took time, but eventually I saved the draft. I have not submitted it yet. I needed to breathe through what that submission would unleash. Around 11, I stepped back into the house to close up for the night. That was when I heard soft footsteps upstairs. Abby appeared at the top of the staircase, holding her water cup, her voice barely above a whisper. She said she accidentally overheard something while passing Dad's old study. She said Dad was talking loudly on speakerphone. She repeated what she heard, each word sounding heavier than the last. "She's snooping. Do something." Dad's voice, sharp, afraid, cornered. Nathan's voice, replying in tones Abby could not fully understand. Something about keeping me in check. Something about not letting things unravel. I froze. The chill that moved through me was not fear. It was recognition. A pattern repeating itself. The same way Dad used to talk about Mom in hushed tones behind closed doors. The same way he spoke about me when I announced my decision to join the FBI. The same way he talked to anyone he wanted to control. Dad was not just hiding something. He was preparing for a fight. I helped Abby back to bed and sat on the edge of the mattress until her breathing slowed again. When I finally returned downstairs, I stood in the dark living room, staring through the window into the still night. Dad was making his move. Nathan was too. Whatever they were guarding was more fragile than ever, and I was no longer the girl they could silence. Not anymore. That thought was the first thing in my head when I woke up the next morning. And the last thing lingering as I brushed my teeth, listening to the low murmur of voices downstairs. I could smell coffee, bacon, and that faint scent of lemon cleaner that always clung to this house. For a second, I let myself watch Abby sleep, lashes resting on her cheeks, her small hand curled around the ear of her stuffed rabbit. She had no idea that her words from the night before had lit the final fuse in me. She is snooping. Do something. Dad was scared. Nathan was scared. And fear made careless people leave trails. By mid-morning, I had Mom settled in the living room with her favorite blanket and a cup of tea. Abby sat beside her on the couch, watching an old cartoon, trying to act like any other little girl visiting her grandma. I told them I needed to run an errand and might be gone for a while. Mom looked like she wanted to ask where, but the years of being married to Dad had trained her not to pry. She just nodded and told me to be careful. My first stop was not Nathan's house. It was a tidy brick office building on the edge of town, where a small wooden sign read, Talbot and Howe, Attorneys at Law. I had looked up Aubrey Talbot the night before. Her name kept popping up in local cases involving elder fraud and financial exploitation. She had a reputation for being ruthless with anyone who took advantage of vulnerable people, and patient with the victims themselves. That was exactly the combination I needed. Her receptionist offered me water and a seat, but it did not take long before Aubrey stepped into the waiting room and shook my hand. She was in her 50s, with silver threaded through her dark hair and eyes that had seen enough human mess to be both kind and unflinching. Once we were in her office, I laid out what I knew so far. The forged loan in Mom's name. The odd timing with Dad's financial trouble around 2018, the late-night movement of files out of the garage, the community fund, the comments from neighbors, the phone call Abby overheard. I did not use my badge as a weapon. I used it as context. I told her I worked financial crimes for the FBI, but I was here as a daughter who had just realized her mom might be a victim in more ways than one. Aubrey listened without interrupting, occasionally jotting notes, occasionally glancing up with a look that said she had heard versions of this story more times than she could count. When I was done, she steepled her fingers and asked one question. Did I have any proof that Nathan physically possessed forged documents or records connected to these issues? I told her about the safe in his office, the way he panicked when he saw my eyes land on it, the neighbor's story about him carrying boxes out of Dad's old office. I admitted I had not seen the contents. Aubrey nodded slowly. If Nathan is holding documents that contain your mom's forged signature, she said, that is a crime. Document fraud. Possible conspiracy. If he is knowingly keeping records of stolen funds or misdirected trust money, that is more than simply being a loyal son. That is participation. The word participation sat heavy between us. I asked what would happen legally if I could get my hands on those documents. Her answer was simple. Then we would have leverage. With real leverage, we could protect Mom, expose what your dad has done, and keep you from being crushed in the process. There was still a part of me that flinched at the idea of turning my own family into evidence, but that part had grown smaller every day since I arrived back in Willow Creek. I thought of Teresa losing her house. I thought of Mom pretending she did not remember signing a loan she clearly never signed. I thought of Abby standing outside Nathan's house, eyes filling with tears as Oliver parroted that my very existence ruined everything. I asked Aubrey, hypothetically, if someone in my position were to access family documents without permission, would it be considered breaking and entering? She gave me a long look and said carefully that she could not advise me to, violate the law. But she could remind me that sometimes people carelessly leave safes unlocked and files visible, and that finding what is already in plain sight is not the same as robbery. Her gaze held mine, as if to make sure I understood exactly what she was not saying. She told me that if I managed to obtain any documents, I should bring them straight to her. Do not confront your dad yet, she said. Do not confront Nathan alone. People who have spent years hiding financial crimes do not react well when their lies are threatened. By the time I left her office, my heart was pounding in a steady, controlled rhythm. Fear was still there, but it was flanked by purpose now. I called Mom to check on Abby, and when I heard my daughter's cheerful voice in the background, it gave me the push I needed. Nathan was out of town for a short work trip. Marilyn had mentioned it casually the day before, complaining that she was stuck alone with Oliver while her husband chased deals. I drove toward their neighborhood with my hands tight on the steering wheel, every streetlight and stop sign blurring into a kind of tunnel vision. I parked a block away and walked the last stretch, needing the cool air on my face to ground me. Marilyn answered the door with dark circles under her eyes. Oliver was standing behind her, pouting, his arms crossed. She looked honestly relieved to see another adult. She said Nathan had just texted that he would be gone an extra day and that Oliver had been acting out all afternoon. He had thrown a tantrum when she turned off his tablet, and at one point had kicked the coffee table hard enough to scare her. I said I could stay for a bit, help with homework or distract him. That was not a lie. Abby was at Mom's, safe. I did plan to be present for Marilyn if she needed support, but I also had another purpose, a purpose sitting behind the door of Nathan's office. Marilyn led me inside. The living room was cluttered with toys and empty juice boxes. There was a smear of peanut butter on the edge of the kitchen counter. This was not the polished place I had seen before. This was a tired mom's reality, stripped of pretense. She apologized for the mess, and I told her she did not need to. There was something in her face that looked like a woman who had signed more than one thing she did not fully understand. While Oliver sat on the floor building a tower with blocks, I offered to straighten the kitchen so she could take a shower or just breathe, alone, for a few minutes. She hesitated, then nodded gratefully and said 10 minutes of hot water sounded like heaven. The moment I heard the bathroom door click shut upstairs and the shower started running, my pulse picked up speed. Nathan's home office door was half open at the end of the hallway. I wiped my hands on a dish towel to stop their shaking and walked toward it as calmly as I could manage. Inside, the room smelled faintly of cologne and printer ink. The desk was cluttered with papers, some face down, some in uneven stacks. And there, tucked behind the desk, was the safe. It was bigger than I remembered. Dark metal, a dial, and a handle. The last time I had seen it, a thin line of light had given away the fact it was not fully closed. I held my breath and stepped closer. My fingers curled around the handle. I turned it gently. The door moved without resistance. No click, no lock, no barrier. He really had left it unlocked. Inside, folders were arranged in the kind of fake order people use when they want to feel organized, without understanding what that actually looks like. I recognized the Whitmore Construction logo on several letterheads. I saw the name of the community fund printed on others, the same name Cole had underlined in his notes. But one thick folder in particular was labeled Whitmore Family Trust. My heart slammed once against my ribs so hard I tasted metal in the back of my throat. I pulled it out and laid it flat on the desk. The first page was a trust agreement, dated around 2015, the year my grandfather died. It stated that his assets, including land and investments, had been placed into a trust for the benefit of Evelyn Whitmore and her daughter, Lauren Whitmore. My name, in clean type, staring up at me from a document I had never seen. The amount listed was $950,000. My vision blurred for a moment. All those years I scraped by in cheap apartments during training. All those nights I counted every paycheck twice before paying rent. And utilities? All those times I told myself it was noble to struggle alone. And there it was. Money that had been meant for Mom and me. Money that somehow never reached us. The signature lines at the bottom made my stomach drop. One line for Mom, one line for the trustee. The trustee was Dad. Of course he was. Mom's signature was a near match to her usual one, But the more I looked, the more wrong it felt. The way the last letter curled strangely, the slight hesitation mark halfway through her name. I had seen forgeries in case files that were less obvious than this. On another page, a witness signature. Nathan. I flipped through additional pages and found transaction records, transfers out of the trust into an account name I did not recognize. A limited liability company with an address matching a small office downtown. I knew Dad had once rented for some side venture. Line after line showing money moving in chunks over several years. Always out, never back in. My breathing grew shallow, but my training kicked in. I took out my phone and snapped photos of every page, careful not to bend or smudge anything. I knew this crossed a line within the family, but legally, ethically, morally, I also knew it was the first real crack in the dam. Behind the trust folder were more records, community fund disbursement statements, loan applications. I saw my mom's name again on one scan, tied to a collateral agreement she would never willingly sign. Every new page confirmed what my gut already knew. This was not a case of sloppy bookkeeping or a single bad decision. This was a structure. A system. It felt like standing at the bottom of a pyramid made of lies, finally seeing the stones that formed its base. I was so focused that I did not hear the small footsteps until they were right behind me. Abby's voice cut through my concentration like a soft bell. "Mom," she whispered, "what are you doing?" I turned, startled. My mind scrambled to remember that I had left her at Mom's house, but of course, I had not. In my need to move quickly, I had forgotten the most important constant in my life. Abby. She must have asked Mom to drop her off to play with Oliver. The way kids assume proximity equals safety. I swallowed hard and carefully slid the documents back where I had found them, leaving everything exactly as it was. Then I closed the safe door gently. It did not click fully locked. Daniel would likely tug it later and assume he had just forgotten to spin the dial. Abby walked closer, her eyes wide and serious, in a way a 7-year-old's eyes should never have to be. She glanced at the papers still on the desk, then back at me. Her voice was barely audible when she spoke again. "Mom, they stole from us, didn't they?" The question hung in the air between us, heavy and heartbreaking. I could have lied. I could have told her that she had misunderstood, but if this family had taught me anything, it was that lies passed down do more damage than any ugly truth. I knelt so we were eye level, placing my hands on her shoulders. I told her that some people make choices that hurt others, especially when they are afraid of losing power. I told her that what was meant for us had been kept from us, and that I was going to do everything in my power to make it right. She nodded slowly, as if my answer confirmed something she already felt in her small, intuitive heart. She slipped her hand into mine, seeking reassurance, but I realized I was the one drawing strength from her. As we stepped back out into the hallway, the normal sounds of the house floated around us. The shower upstairs had turned off. Oliver's cartoons droned from the living room. It all looked so ordinary on the surface. Toys on the floor, family photos on the walls, a coat rack with too many jackets, yet behind one thin office door, inside one carelessly unlocked safe, I had just touched the first layer of a carefully constructed lie. A lie built on trust betrayed, money diverted, and signatures stolen. And standing there with Abby's small fingers wrapped around mine, I knew with absolute certainty that we had only brushed the surface. This was just the first tier of a much higher pyramid, and walking out of Nathan's office with Abby's hand in mine, I felt the weight of every stone above us. On the drive back to Mom's house, Abby sat unusually quiet in the back seat. Normally, she hummed or narrated stories to her stuffed rabbit, but this time she just watched the trees blur past the window. Halfway down Willow Lane, she finally spoke, her voice small and steady. "Mom, is Grandpa going to be mad that you saw his papers?" I told her honestly that he might be, but that sometimes grown-ups had to do hard things to keep the people they love safe. She thought about that for a moment, then nodded, and went back to tracing shapes in the fog on the glass. When we pulled into the driveway, Mom was sitting on the front porch in her sweater, fingers twisted together, eyes scanning the street, as if she could sense when something had shifted. The late afternoon light washed her in a soft gold that made her look even more fragile. The sight of her waiting there, worrying, made my chest ache. I helped Abby out of the car, and Mom stood up quickly. "You were gone longer than I expected," she said, her voice light but stretched thin. "Everything is all right." I told her we should talk inside. There was a breeze picking up, carrying that familiar smell of damp earth and the faint sweetness from the maple tree in the yard. Abby ran ahead into the living room, dropping her backpack near the couch. She asked softly if she could watch something on television. I said yes. I wanted her close, but I also did not want her to absorb every detail of the conversation I was about to have. Mom followed me into the kitchen. The worn linoleum floor creaked in the same spots it always had. I pulled out a chair for her at the table and sat down opposite. My hands felt heavier than they should have as I reached into my bag and took out the printed copies of the trust documents and the loan agreement I had found in Nathan's safe. I spread them carefully on the table between us. She looked at the papers, then at me, confusion swimming behind her eyes. "What is this, Lauren?" Her fingers hovered over the first page as if she were afraid to touch it. I told her as simply as I could. "It is a trust that Grandpa set up before he died. For you and for me." I traced the title with my fingertip. Whitmore Family Trust. I pointed out the date, the amount, the list of assets that had been folded into it. I watched the color drain from her face as the reality sank in. Her lips parted in a soundless "oh" when I showed her her own name, typed neatly on the document, following by a signature that was supposed to be hers. She bent closer, studying the curl of each letter, the pressure of the pen strokes. I saw her shoulders start to tremble. "Lauren, I do not remember signing this," she whispered. "Not once." I nodded, my throat tight. "I know, because you did not." And I told her what I had seen in Nathan's office. The trust fund transfers. The account with the limited liability company name that had no reason to be connected to our family. The way Nathan had signed as a witness. The timing of the withdrawals that lined up with Dad's supposed financial troubles. She covered her mouth with one hand. Tears formed and gathered along her lower lashes, then fell, leaving small, dark spots on the table. For a long moment she could not speak. When she finally did, her voice sounded like it had been dragged through gravel. "He told me we had no money," she murmured. "He told me we were barely keeping our heads above water. He said I had no idea how hard he worked to keep this house, to pay for everything you and Nathan needed." I felt anger burn low in my chest, but I kept my tone calm. I asked her if she remembered signing anything at the bank. She shook her head slowly. Then she pressed her fingertips into her temples as if trying to reach back through years of fog. "There was a pause," she said quietly, "around the time I had my surgery. Remember when I had that scare with my heart?" I nodded. I remembered. She had been so weak, hooked up to monitors, pale as the sheets. Dad had played the role of devoted husband for the doctors, but I remembered the tightness at the corners of his mouth whenever costs were mentioned. Her eyes stared past me now, fixed on some point in the past. "He came into my hospital room one night," she said. "He was angry. I had asked about calling you. He said you did not need to be distracted from your important work." The words tasted bitter in her mouth. Then he pulled out a folder and said if I wanted the treatments to continue, if I wanted to stay in this house and not be a burden, I needed to sign some papers. My stomach turned. "Did you read them?" I asked gently. She shook her head, shame flickering across her face. They were full of numbers and terms I did not understand. I was exhausted. I was scared. He said it was simple. Just authorizing him to handle certain accounts so he could protect the family. He said I never understood money and that this was the only way to keep things from falling apart. He put a pen in my hand and pointed where to sign. I could see it so clearly. It felt like a scene I had personally witnessed. A vulnerable woman in a hospital gown, scared for her life, pressured by the man she depended on. A man who knew exactly what he was doing. Mom's shoulders shook as she remembered. "There were other times," she added. "Times when I tried to call you. He would come into the room as soon as he heard your name, hang up the phone, pull the cord from the wall. Once he took the house phone and locked it in his office. He said you had chosen your path and that bringing you into our problems would only make things worse. He said you would judge us. I realized with a sick twist of clarity that all those missed calls, all those stretches of silence I had blamed on distance or busyness, were not accidental. They had been orchestrated. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I wanted to tell you so many times, she said, but he would stand at the doorway and just watch, like he could hear what I was thinking. I started to believe him, that I was the one making trouble, that I should be grateful he took such good care of us. I slid my hand across the table and took hers. The veins stood out more than they used to, the skin thinner, softer. You were not making trouble, I said quietly. You were being controlled. That is not the same as being difficult. That is not the same as being ungrateful. She let out a broken laugh that quickly turned into another sob. The sound tore at something deep inside me. When she finally caught her breath, she said there was one thing she had never told me. She looked almost afraid to say it now. I told her I could handle it. She stared down at the trust papers again, then spoke in a flat, hollow tone. One night, after you left for Quantico, he came home from some meeting with the board, looking furious. He poured himself a drink, then another, and another. I asked what was wrong. He slammed his glass on the counter and said, "Lauren is the biggest embarrassment of my life." The words sat heavy between us. I had always suspected that was how he saw me, but hearing it confirmed, it still felt like a knife slipping between ribs. It was not just disappointment, it was humiliating. To him, my choice to work for the FBI, to investigate the very kind of financial crimes he was neck-deep in, was not a betrayal of loyalty. It was a threat to his survival. Mom continued, "He said you had turned your back on everything he built, that you were probably out there laughing at our struggles. He said if you ever came back sniffing around our business, he would make sure you regretted it." She swallowed hard, then added so softly I almost did not hear it. "He said you would never understand what it took to protect a family, that you were too righteous for your own good." I sat there and let those words sink in. All the years I had wondered why every interaction with Dad felt like walking into a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided finally made sense. He did not just dislike my career, he feared it. Not because I carried a badge, but because I carried the tools to dig out what he had been burying for 20 years. He did not hate that I worked for the FBI. He hated that I was capable of pulling the mask off the life he had built. For a moment, the kitchen around us blurred. The ticking clock on the wall, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint sound of cartoon voices from the living room. All of it faded behind the roar of realization inside my head. I thought of the trust fund, almost $1 million meant for Mom and me, siphoned into some shell company. I thought of Teresa's lost savings. I thought of Abby, standing in Nathan's yard, listening to a 6-year-old boy repeat poison he barely understood. I squeezed Mom's hand gently. "You were not crazy," I said. "You were not weak. You were surviving in the only way you knew how, with a man who held everything over you. But it stops now. He does not get to decide what we know anymore." At that moment, Abby appeared in the doorway, hovering on the threshold, with her stuffed rabbit pressed to her chest. She had that look kids get when they sense something serious is happening, even if they do not have the words for it. Her eyes flicked from the papers, to Mom's wet cheeks, to my face. "Are we in trouble?" she asked softly. My heart cracked a little at the fear in her voice. I opened my free arm and she rushed into the kitchen, climbing onto my lap and then leaning across the table to wrap one arm around Mom's shoulders. Her small body pressed in between us like a warm bridge. "We are not in trouble," I told her. "Some people should be, but not us." Abby looked straight at Mom, her young face suddenly fierce in a way that reminded me so much of my own. Reflection, it hurt. "From now on, we will protect each other, okay?" she said. "All of us. No more secrets that make us scared." Mom let out a choked sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob and pulled Abby into a hug so tight I could see her fingers tremble. I rested my hand on both of their backs and felt something shift in that small kitchen. It was not dramatic. There were no grand declarations, just 3 generations of women sitting at a worn table, finally sharing the same painful truth instead of being kept in separate cages of silence. Outside, a car passed by, its tires hissing on the pavement. Somewhere in town, Dad was probably pacing his office, talking to Nathan about how to put the walls back up. But in that moment, in that house, I realized he had already lost the one thing he had always counted on: our silence. And once silence breaks, there is no way to gather all the shards and pretend nothing happened. Outside, a car passed, and the sound of its tires faded into the distance. And in that quiet, I realized he no longer had our silence to hide behind. The next morning, I woke up with that thought still lodged in my chest. For years, everything in this family had been handled in small, whispered conversations, behind closed doors, in rooms where one person held the power. If I tried to confront Dad on his turf, he would twist the narrative like he always did, make me look hysterical and ungrateful, and everyone else would fold to keep the peace. I needed neutral ground. I needed witnesses who were not afraid of him. That was why I called Margot. She picked up on the second ring, her voice warm and steady. I told her I needed a place to gather the family, someone Dad could not control. Without asking for details, she said we could use her living room that afternoon. There was a firmness in her tone that told me she already suspected more than I had voiced. She had watched our family from next door for decades. She had seen things. I spent the rest of the morning assembling everything: printed copies of the trust documents, the forged loan in Mom's name, notes from Cole about the community fund, bank statements showing the transfers into Dad's limited liability company account. Every piece of paper was another brick in the wall of truth I was building. I slipped them into a neat stack inside a plain folder, my hands calm and precise, the way they only ever were at work. On my phone, I queued up an audio file I had stored away years ago and almost forgotten. It was a recording I made in 2015 after a particularly cruel call from Dad. At the time, I told myself I saved it as evidence in case things ever got worse, but I had tucked it so far back in my mind that I barely remembered what he said. Now it might be the one thing that cut through his performance better than any document ever could. I told Mom we were going to talk to everyone. Her face paled, but she nodded. There was fear there, yes, but also a glimmer of something else. Relief. She had carried this alone long enough. Abby sat at the table, eating cereal and watching our faces. When I told her we were all going to Miss Margot's house later, she asked if Oliver would be there. I said yes. Her eyes darkened for a second. Then she straightened her shoulders in a way that looked far too grown for a 7-year-old. She said she wanted to come anyway. Calling Dad and Nathan was the hardest part. David answered with that clipped tone he used whenever he thought he was about to be inconvenienced. I told him I had information about the family finances that needed to be discussed with everyone present, and that we would be meeting at Margot's at 3. He snorted and said I was not in any position to summon him anywhere. Then I mentioned the trust in my name and Mom's and the transfers into his company account. There was a pause so long I could hear his breathing change. Finally, he said he would be there. Nathan was jumpier. When I called, he tried to brush me off with remarks about being busy. I told him this was about legal documents in his safe and his signature as a witness on a forged trust. His denial came fast and too loud. Then he dropped his voice and said Dad had everything under control and that dragging outsiders into family matters would only make things worse. I told him calmly that the problem was not outsiders. The problem was the law. He hung up without agreeing. 10 minutes later, I received a text saying they would come. At 3 o'clock, Margot's living room filled with the people who had shaped and scarred my life. Margot had moved some of her plants aside to make room for extra chairs. Sunlight streamed through lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the hardwood floor. Mom sat on the sofa, hands folded tightly in her lap. Abby perched beside him, stubbornly holding her stuffed rabbit like a small talisman. I stood near the coffee table with the folder in my hands, heart beating slow and steady. Nathan was the first to arrive, dragging Oliver behind him. Marilyn followed, looking drawn and anxious, her eyes avoiding mine. Nathan wore his smooth business face, the one that said, I am the reasonable one here. David walked in last, without knocking, as if this too were his house. He took in the arrangement of chairs and the stack of papers on the table and gave a cold little smile. This some kind of intervention? He asked, his gaze never leaving my face. I did not answer his bait. Instead, I gestured for everyone to sit. Margot hovered near the doorway, arms folded, her presence a quiet line of defense. This was her home. Da could not bark at her to leave the room or send her on errands. That mattered more than anyone else in the space understood. When everyone settled, the room fell into a heavy silence. You could almost hear the house breathe. I opened the folder and laid the first document on the coffee table, where everyone could see. My voice did not shake. "This is the Whitmore Family Trust," I said. "Creative in 2015, when Grandpa died. The beneficiaries are Mom and me. The trustee is Dad." Mom flinched at the sight of her name. Nathan shifted in his chair. Dad leaned back, expression blank. I pointed to the amount. $950,000. I let the number hang there. Marilyn's eyes widened. Oliver swung his legs restlessly, not understanding, but sensing the tension. I moved my finger to the signature lines. "This is Mom's signature, or supposed to be." I glanced at her. "Mom, is this yours?" She studied it. Tears filled her eyes almost immediately. Her voice came out a whisper. "No, that is not how I sign my name." I looked at Nathan. "You signed as a witness." He opened his mouth, closed it, then forced out that it had all been handled through proper channels. Those lawyers were involved, that I was dredging up paperwork I did not understand. I picked up the next page, the one showing transfers from the trust into the limited liability company account. "Then explain this," I said. "Repeated withdrawals from the trust into an account under Dad's side business. No documentation of disbursements to Mom. No documentation of disbursements to me. Just money flowing in one direction." Dad's jaw tightened. He said he had moved funds temporarily to cover investments that would benefit everyone later. He called it smart financial management. He said I had no right to question him when I had abandoned the family business. I placed the forged loan document on the table next. "This was taken out in Mom's name during her heart surgery," I said. "She does not remember signing it. The signature is inconsistent with her normal one. The amount correlates with a hole in the community fund the same year." He knows, I thought, watching his eyes. He knows exactly how each piece fits. I pulled out the notes from Cole. But I referenced the investigation into the Willow Creek Community Renewal Fund. The missing grants. The victims like Teresa, who lost tens of thousands of dollars, and her home. I laid out how Dad had been the gatekeeper of applications, how his personal accounts recovered miraculously after the storm, while the fund dried up. Ethan tried to interrupt, saying this was all circumstantial and that I sounded like some conspiracy blogger. Marilyn, who had been silent up to that point, suddenly spoke. "That is not true," she said, voice trembling but loud enough to carry across the room. "He made me sign things I did not understand." Everyone turned toward her. Nathan hissed her name under his breath, but she kept going. Her hands shook as she twisted her wedding ring. "He told me to sign as a witness on that loan," she said. "He said it was just a formality. When I asked questions, he told me not to worry about my pretty head and said Dad knew what he was doing." There was another time, she added, when he put a stack of documents on the dining table, all tied to the community fund, and told me to sign as secretary. I never saw any minutes or real meetings. It was just papers. Oliver's eyes darted between his parents, his small face pale. He had never seen them argue like this in front of him. The room hummed with that awful quiet that sits on top of fear. Dad barked that this was enough. He said families talk things through privately, that dragging this mess into a neighbor's house was a betrayal. He glared at me, eyes hard, and said I was trying to destroy my own family with my badge and my ego. He called me disloyal, ungrateful, vindictive. He said the reason this family was falling apart was because I came back with accusations instead of humility. Every insult he hurled landed with a familiar sting, but this time they did not sink in the same way. Years of distance and training had built armor around the softest parts of my heart. I had Abby now. I had Mom beside me. I had facts on paper. I told him calmly that families are supposed to protect each other, not steal from each other, that love is not leverage, and loyalty is not silence. His face flushed red. He opened his mouth to unleash more, but I held up a hand. I said there was one more thing we needed to hear, something from his own mouth, from a time when he thought no one would ever be able to replay his words. I took out my phone, scrolled to the audio file dated 8 years earlier, and pressed play. The sound of my younger voice came through first, thinner and more tentative. I had called him to tell him I had been assigned to a new unit focusing on corporate fraud. On the recording, I heard myself say that I was proud, and that I hoped one day he would be too. Then his voice filled Margot's living room. "You have no idea what you are doing." His recorded tone was sharp, dripping contempt. "You go digging into things that have nothing to do with you, and you are going to bring trouble to this family. You think you are better than us because you wear that little badge? You are an embarrassment, Lauren. If you ever come sniffing around my business, I will make sure you regret it." The room went dead still. Even Oliver stopped moving. Hearing it now, with everything we had uncovered, the meaning was unmistakable. He was not warning me for my own good. He was protecting himself. He was terrified that my job might one day intersect with his crimes. Dad lurched forward slightly in his chair. "Turn that off," he snapped. "That is taken out of context." I looked him straight in the eye. "That is your voice, Dad. No context could make those words into anything but what they are." Nathan's composure cracked. He had been sitting with his arms crossed, presenting himself as the reasonable son trying to mediate, but now his leg bounced uncontrollably. His face looked slick with sweat. He suddenly exploded, his voice louder than I had ever heard. "He told me to do it," Nathan shouted. "Dad told me to move the boxes, to sign the papers, to get the money where he needed it. I was only doing what he asked. I did not come up with any of this." Marilyn flinched. Mom inhaled sharply. Margot's eyebrows shot up. Dad turned on Nathan with a look that could have cut glass. He told him to shut up, called him ungrateful, and said no real man blamed his father for his own choices. But in his rush to cover himself, he said too much. He ranted about how hard he had worked to secure that trust, how he deserved to manage funds as he saw fit, how people who benefited from his sacrifices had no right to question his methods. Every sentence dug the hole deeper. He insisted that any withdrawals were temporary, that the community fund had suffered from bureaucratic red tape, that if a few signatures were less than perfect, it was only because Mom got confused easily and needed help. He talked himself in circles, contradicting one excuse with the next, trying to patch one leak only to cause another. It was like watching a structure collapse in real time. The myth of the stoic provider, the wise businessman, the loving but misunderstood father. All of it cracked and fell away under the combined weight of his own recorded threats and the documents on the table. I looked at Abby. She was sitting very still, her eyes wide, her mouth pressed into a thin line. She was seeing her grandfather clearly for the first time, not as the larger-than-life figure everyone tiptoed around, but as a man who hurt people to keep his secrets buried. Oliver sat on the floor next to her, clutching his toy so tightly his knuckles were white. For the first time, he looked scared of his own dad. Around us, the Whitmore family legend disintegrated. What remained in that quiet, sunlit room was just a group of people facing the consequences of long, protected lies. The air felt different, thinner, cleaner somehow, even as it burned going into my lungs. Adam glared at me, breathing hard. In his eyes, I saw something I had never seen before when he looked at me. Not disappointment, not condescension, fear. And in that moment, standing there with my mom, my daughter, my brother, his wife, and their child all seeing him clearly, I understood that whatever happened next, nothing in this family would ever go back to the way it had been. Fear. It was the first time I had ever seen it in his eyes, and it stayed with me long after he stormed out of Margot's living room, slamming her front door so hard the windows rattled. Nathan hurried after him, yelling something I could not make out. Marilyn collapsed into a chair, shaking. Mom looked stunned, hollowed out. Abby crawled into my lap without saying a word, and I held her, feeling her small heartbeat pressed against my ribs. We stayed like that for several minutes, until the dust of shock finally settled, and everyone began to drift out of Margot's house in a quiet, I drove Mom and Abby home, made sure they ate something, and then tucked Abby into bed. But sleep did not come for me that night. I lay awake listening to the house breathe, replaying every word, every look, every revelation. By dawn, I had made my decision. It was time to hand everything over. The next morning, I gathered the folder, my photos of the trust documents, the statements linking the trust money to the limited liability company, the evidence from Cole, and the recorded audio file. I drove to the district field office where IRS criminal investigation shared space with state financial regulators. The parking lot was half empty, the early morning sun barely clearing the trees. I sat in the car for a moment, breathing in and out, letting the weight of the moment settle. Inside the building, everything smelled faintly of paper and disinfectant. I checked in at the front desk, flashed my badge, and asked to speak with the duty agent for financial fraud intake. Within minutes, I was sitting in a small conference room with 2 investigators, both older than me, both with the calm, seasoned expressions of people who had seen too much and were not shocked by much anymore. I laid everything out on the table and walked them through it piece by piece. At first, their expressions were neutral. Then their eyebrows lifted. Then they exchanged glances. They asked pointed questions. They asked for clarifications on dates. They asked for a chain of custody on the copies. When I played the audio file of Dad's threat from 2015, neither of them moved, but the air in the room changed. By the end of the meeting, they said words I had been waiting to hear for years, even before I understood what they meant. We will open a formal investigation. After signing the necessary forms and transferring copies of all evidence, I walked out of the building into the bright morning light, feeling both lighter and heavier at the same time. Justice has a weight. It settles on your shoulders differently than guilt, differently than grief. It is heavier in some ways, cleaner in others. Within a week, federal agents executed search warrants on Dad's financial records. They subpoenaed old company files, community fund ledgers, and accounts associated with the limited liability company. Once the paper trail was forced into the light, the cracks became chasms, transactions that made no sense, signatures that were sloppy imitations of Mom's handwriting, withdrawals from the trust fund aligning perfectly with missing community grant money, entire folders of falsified witness documents, statements bearing Nathan's signature that now looked painfully incriminating for him. The charges began stacking like brittle cards: tax fraud, community fund misappropriation, credit identity misuse, coercion of a vulnerable adult. The last one pierced me the deepest. When I visited Mom's doctor for records confirming her condition during the time she claimed Dad coerced her into signing, the physician did not hesitate. Her file clearly showed she was under sedation and medically impaired. It was all there in black and white: dates, procedures, medications, vital signs, evidence that Dad had taken advantage of a woman in one of the weakest moments of her life. Nathan's involvement came under review next. He had signed several witness documents knowingly. Investigators interviewed him about the boxes moved late at night from Dad's garage in 2018. He tried to claim ignorance, but he cracked quickly. People who participate out of fear often crumble faster than those who mastermind the scheme. He was not charged immediately, but they made it clear he could face penalties ranging from heavy fines to probation to an official fraud conviction if he did not cooperate. The look on his face when he realized Dad could not shield him anymore was something I will never forget. The Whitmore family splintered in slow motion. Dad retained an attorney known for aggressive defenses in white-collar cases, but even that man looked strained, trying to spin the documents in his favor. Mom received a letter restoring her full financial authority over her accounts and assets. For the first time in decades, her name was untangled from Dad's manipulations. One evening, as I cooked dinner, Abby walked into the kitchen carrying her stuffed rabbit. She climbed onto a stool and asked if Grandpa still loved us. The question hit me hard. Children see the world in simple terms. Love means kindness, safety, warmth. They cannot comprehend that love can become twisted into something else entirely when woven together with ego and fear. I told her the truth, gently. Sometimes people love in ways that hurt others. Sometimes people hide things because they are afraid of the consequences. And sometimes the truth feels scary at first, but telling it is the only way to protect the people we care about. She nodded, absorbing it far deeper than I wanted her to. Then she asked if we were safe now. I told her absolutely yes. Her shoulders relaxed. She leaned into my side, and I kissed the top of her head. A week later, Dad was brought in for a second round of questioning. Midway through, he had a spike in blood pressure and collapsed against the table. They rushed him to the hospital. He regained consciousness after stabilization and immediately demanded to see me. Not Mom, not Nathan, me. When the hospital administrator called, I closed my eyes and let the silence stretch for a moment. Then I told her no. There was nothing he could say that would undo what he had done, or what I had uncovered. I wished him medical stability, but I did not owe him my presence. That part of my life had ended the moment I stepped into the IRS office with the truth. That night, after I put Abby to bed, my phone vibrated. A message from Nathan. Please, do not let them destroy my life. I did what Dad asked. I did not know how bad it was. I have a wife, a child. I cannot lose everything. I stared at the text for a long time. I thought of Oliver's frightened eyes. I thought of Marilyn signing papers she did not understand. I thought of every time Nathan sided with Dad, every time he ridiculed me, every time he chose power over conscience. I thought of the trust fund he helped drain. I thought of Mom crying at the kitchen table. And I realized something simple and unshakable. I was not destroying his life. He had already done that himself. I turned off my phone and sat by the window in the quiet glow of the living room lamp, listening to the gentle hum of the night outside. The gears of justice were moving now, slowly, methodically, but without pause. For the first time in years, I felt the beginnings of something like peace. Not full peace, not yet, but the kind that comes from knowing you have stepped into the storm instead of running from it. The truth was out. The consequences were unfolding. And the final chapter of our family's reckoning was drawing near. The morning light in Raleigh felt different, softer, warmer, almost like the sun itself had been holding its breath, waiting for us to arrive. After everything that had unraveled in Willow Creek, step into this new home felt like walking into a life I never believed I was allowed to have. Mom stood on the porch with a cup of tea, looking steadier than I had seen her in years. Abby ran barefoot across the small patch of grass in the backyard, chasing the neighborhood kids who had already waved to her with easy smiles. No whispers, no judgment, no weight pressing down on her tiny shoulders. Just childhood, the way it was meant to be. Our first week here was a blur of unpacking, meeting neighbors, finding the nearest grocery store, and learning the rhythm of the quiet street lined with maple trees. Abby started school on a Tuesday. She came home that afternoon carrying a hand-drawn map to the playground and a note from her teacher saying she was adjusting beautifully. Mom began physical therapy twice a week and spent afternoons watering her. Herbs on the patio, letting her body relearn a life without stress beating down on her. And me. I stepped into the Raleigh field office, unsure of what my future held. But within 3 days, my supervisor called me in and told me I was being considered for a lead role in a new financial crimes unit. He said my recent casework, while not fully detailed in file due to conflict of interest protocols, had shown initiative, precision, and integrity. Hearing that word again, integrity, triggered something inside me. A release. A small exhale of pride I had kept locked away for too long. One evening, about 2 weeks after we settled it, Mom suggested we finally open the last moving box labeled Attic Memories. We gathered on the living room floor after dinner. Abby sat cross-legged next to me, leaning into my shoulder as if opening a treasure chest. Mom lifted the first lid, and inside were pieces of a life I had put away to survive. Old school papers, a photo from my first day of college, a medal from a training course, a dried flower Dad had once given Mom when they were still young and hopeful. Then Abby reached under a stack of programs and pulled out a framed picture. Her eyes widened and she held it up with both hands. It was me, at 24 years old, standing in front of the FBI Academy flag in Quantico, freshly graduated, grinning the way only someone who had fought hard for their dreams could grin. My hair was shorter then. My posture was straighter. My eyes were bright with certainty. Mom touched the edge of the frame. "I have always been proud of you," she said quietly. "Even when I could not say it out loud. Even when your dad tried to make me feel wrong for believing in you." Her voice trembled, but it was no longer with fear. It was released. Abby looked at the picture and then at me. "That is you. Younger you. Happy you. You look strong." Something in my throat tightened. I told her I was strong then, and even stronger now. She nodded like she already knew that. Later that night, after Mom went to bed and Abby fell asleep with her new stuffed fox tucked under her chin, I checked my inbox. Nathan had sent another email. It was long, nearly 3 pages of mixed apologies and excuses. He admitted to knowing more than he let on, but claimed Dad had manipulated him. He said he was scared. He said he was only trying to protect his family. He asked me to call him so we could talk. I closed the email without responding. Ina does not require letting everyone back in. Sometimes healing is knowing who no longer gets access to your peace. David had been silent since the investigation escalated. No calls, no letters, no tantrums or shouting or orders for Nathan to follow. The absence of his voice was an unexpected thing. Not comforting, not painful, just empty. A shade of life where his control used to be. For the first time, I realized he was no longer in a position to shape any part of my world, and that absence felt like freedom. One Saturday morning, Abby and I walked to the farmer's market a few blocks from our house. She held my hand, swinging it as she skipped beside me. Mom joined us slowly, smiling softly, letting the sunlight warm her face. We bought fresh peaches and honey and a small bouquet of wildflowers for them. Dining table. A vendor recognized my badge clipped to my bag and thanked me for my service. I felt a flash of humility. For years, Dad had mocked my career. For years, I carried that weight like a shadow. But here, in this new city, people saw me differently. Or maybe, for the first time, I saw myself differently. That evening, as we cooked dinner together, Abby looked up from slicing strawberries and asked a question I knew was coming eventually. "Mom, are we ever going back there?" Willow Creek, the house where she had been humiliated, the place where I had been erased, the community where appearances meant everything and truth meant nothing. I wiped my hands on a towel, knelt beside her, and cupped her face. Home is not a place, Abby. It is people who love you. We are not going back to places that hurt us. We go forward to places that welcome us. She smiled, nodded, and hugged me with the full force of her tiny body. Life slowly found its new shape. Evenings on the porch, Abby's laughter echoing through the hall. Mom hummed as she kneaded dough for biscuits. My work fills my days with purpose. No tension, no fear. No walking on fragile ground, just steady breathing and the quiet satisfaction of building a world we deserved all along. One night, after tucking Abby into bed and switching off the kitchen lights, I stepped outside. The sky was clear above Raleigh, a deep blue blanket dotted with stars. I felt something settle inside me, something I had chased across years of chaos without knowing its name. It was peaceful, pure and unbroken. And standing in that stillness, I understood something simple and powerful. Sometimes you cannot save the family you come from, but you can build the family you need. You can choose truth over silence. You can choose courage over shame. You can choose yourself. If you have ever been told you were too much or not enough for your own family, remember this: silence can be power, and truth can be the loudest revenge. Tell me in the comments what integrity means to you and where you are listening from.